library. Outside of the library, we've got some beautiful grounds, community garden. There's a creek that flows into the Nooksack River here in Deming, Washington, the ancestral homeland of the Nooksack people. More broadly, we're here in Whatcom County, the ancestral homeland of the Lummi people. Together, the Nooksack and Lummi people have been its stewards since time immemorial, respecting the land, river, and ocean with the understanding that everything is connected, related, and alive. We acknowledge the elders and their collective and individual plights and achievements. We consider the legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together today. And we pursue ongoing action to build lasting relationships and grow together so that all may prosper. With that, it's time for us to get started. There's a lot that I could say about Jess Walter. There's a lot. I thought what I would do is actually start with a quote from her. Cold Millions, which is gives us a glimpse into the time of mining and timber. We're building glittering cities, Seattle and Spokane. And at that same time, the laborers doing the work were treated with disdain. One of the main characters, Rye, flushed with sadness, as if every moment of his life were occurring all at once. His sister dying in childbirth, his mother squirming in that one-room flock, poor Danny sliding between wet logs, Gig in jail, and Jules dead, and how many more? All people, except this rich cream, living and scraping and fighting and dying, and for what? Nothing. The cold millions, with no chance in this world. Please give a round of applause as we welcome Jess. And I'd also like to welcome colleagues who I absolutely love working with, Katrina, Carabba, branch manager of the Deming Library, and Erin, Suda.
I'm really excited to be here, and I just wanted to let you all know we're going to do this book discussion a little bit differently today. We want to try something out, so we really appreciate you being here, and we want to get all the questions from everyone included in the end here into our Q&A. So what we're going to do is make sure that everyone has a note card and a pencil. Hopefully when you came in you noticed that you got that. Okay, so that for right now is if you have a question for Jess that you came in with right now, go ahead and write that down just so that you have it and you remember it. And Katrina and I are going to interview and talk with Jess here for the next little bit. And during that time, if other questions or ideas come up for you, go ahead and jot those down. And then about halfway through the program, we're gonna take a break and we're gonna do some little bit of small group work to work with those questions through the audience, and then we'll continue on with the audience questions for the second half. So I appreciate you trying this out with us and just being open to discussing this wonderful book with each other. So.
I like this good cop, bad cop thing. I just want to know where the trouble's going to come from. So if you guys notice, just point out that's the bad cop. Okay.
Yeah, I have a belt, just in case you're worried.
Yeah,
there's going to be a time thing. There is a time thing.
All right, well, I get to ask the first question. So, the topics within your books just vary over a wide range of real and historical terrain. Where do your ideas come from, and what was the inspiration for the Cold Millions?
Wow, I thought you were the good cop. That's, you know, the ideas are, I think of them almost like snowflakes that accrete with other things. Like I'll be in Italy and I'll have some vision of this beachside town, and I'll think, who's this person arriving? And then I'll start thinking about aging and about how we are kind of the ruins of the dreams we once had, and phrases will click, and language often is part of it. It really is everything I'm thinking about through a 4, 5, 6 year period, focused through the lens of a narrative that I've fallen in love with, and language I've fallen in love with. With the Cold Millions, that language of the Bindlestiffs of early 1900s America, of the West, of Spokane, the town that I was in, being one of the most central places in the world. If you were an entertainer in 1909 and you got your schedule and you saw you were going to Spokane, you'd think, oh God, finally some civilization. You know, I've made it through Montana. I don't have to go to that harbor like Seattle yet. I get to go to a place with a decent hotel and good food. And imagining my city as, you know, as the sort of center of this growing wealth was just fascinating because I grew up in a much more stagnant Spokane. So those sorts of images, and then it always connects sort of emotionally and sometimes politically with what's going on around me. And so seeing the way in which income inequality had returned to levels that we hadn't seen since the last Gilded Age made me want to write about the Gilded Age. And then family. I come from working class stock. Both of my grandfathers were itinerant workers who hopped trains. My grandpa Jess, who I've named after, used to tell me these stories. And as an 8-year-old whose favorite book is Treasure Island, jumping a train sounded to me like being on a pirate ship, you know. And so trying to capture the romance of the stories my grandpa told me. And he told me, here's where you catch a train. You don't do it, you know, you wait till it's right when it pulls out of the station or a crossing, it's going its slowest. Here's how you jump on. I don't know how many times as a kid I was like, nope, I'm not doing it. So it went right by our house, and I think I should just jump that train. Might end up somewhere fascinating. And so part of it was that, and then you, as with all stories, you just end up getting so caught up in the characters. Once you invent this narrative of these characters, and because some of these were historical, real figures, I became so enamored with them. And I wanted to honor a person like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who I could barely imagine existing in 2019 and 2018 as I was writing the book, let alone 1909. You know, this 19-year-old pregnant labor activist standing on street corners fighting against these corrupt powers. I was just taken away by the story. Usually I get to a point where I can't not write the book. And anyone who's been reading a book and you can't put it down, it's the same feeling but a lot slower. You know, you're just like, what's going to happen? Where are these people going to go? How am I going to get out of this? And you just write. You find a sort of almost hypnotic groove that takes you along for parts of months, and it's a really thrilling way to, you know, experience the story. And when I look back at the book, I usually find traces of a lot of the things, conversations I've had with my kids about activism and politics. You know, a homeless person that I've seen on the street, reflections I've had on being a parent or a husband or a brother. I find the way it bubbles in to be the most glorious kind of autobiography. A lot more interesting than if I wrote a novel about a kid growing up in the Spokane Valley like I did. So I guess all those things kind of come together to build the novels, and this one in particular.
Right? You know, after you've written it, then it goes out to the world. So, you know, I've been wondering, there's a lot of criticism and analysis and interpretation, and so when I was reading a little bit about the Cold Millions, Book Rag says in the Cold Millions, Mrs. Ricky's orchard represents hope, or, you know, in the beautiful ruins, they say the portraits in the pillbox bunker represent Dee's character, you know, all these ideas. I'm just wondering, is that true? Is that how you think about it too? Do you construct images in your book specifically to like enhance characters or settings, you know? How does that happen?
Yeah, definitely. But they aren't always the same ones that readers get. It's the thing I love about writing books is it's a piece of music that I've written, and you're going to perform it differently than I did. And so, yeah, Mrs. Ricci's house is a kind of, it is, you know, Rye and Gig aspire for very different things. Gig aspires to a larger political view that Rye can't see as, both in his personality and as a younger man. He wants a warm bed, and he wants the mother that he hasn't known. He wants someone to take care of him, and I think Mrs. Ricci kind of symbolizes that in a way in her house. But yeah, I always think of my books as sort of an elaborate set of symbols and ideas percolating beneath the surface. But I'm a surface reader too. I want to just follow the story. I don't want to have to, read that every time someone eats a donut, it symbolizes sex, which it does, by the way. I don't crush donuts in my books because I'm either horny or hungry. So, actually hungry. I don't think there has to be a symbolic reading. The book of mine that is probably the most like that is The Zero, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. And I can always tell with a reading when someone wants to talk about The Zero, because it's usually like a post-grad English student with big bags under her eyes, and she's, got the book, and she's like, I think wasabi marinated duck is the same as weapons of mass destruction. Don't tell anyone. And so there's a sort of deep symbolic nature to that book. And I remember speaking to postdoc English students at Purdue University, and they were just using words that I didn't even understand. And I was like, yes, I agree with that. Writing it down. And they're like, are you thinking pedagogically when you're writing this book? And I'm like, pedagogically, I don't know. And so it was thrilling to have people read at a level that maybe sometimes you're doing things within a tradition of English that you're not recognizing, but that they've studied, and so they're taken to a slightly deeper level. It's so thrilling to have that happen. But for me, I'm often just carried away with the story. And then later I think, oh, libraries in this book symbolize America. Rye is in Len Brand's library, which is the most unfair place he's ever been. Where does he end at the end of the book? In a Carnegie Library, where for almost the only time he's treated like a human being. And when that librarian slides out those other volumes of War and Peace, I'm seriously crying as I type that. And I don't know what's happening. But I'm just like, this is what I dream of America, is a place where a poor indigent kid can check out the same books as a millionaire. And that's the only place that exists in Rye's America. And it's one of the only places that exists in ours sometimes, I think. So, yes and no.
Thank you. That scene where Rye goes to the library, I've been listening to just sort of like immerse myself in the book this last weekend. I heard that part on my drive home last night, and it was just giving me chills.
Yeah.
That is so impactful moment in the story.
I've been trying to visit the Carnegie Library in every city I go to on this, since this book came out. There are a lot of cities doing these community read things through the NEA and other places. And so to be in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and see their beautiful Carnegie Library. And ironically, those libraries were funded by the very sort of wealth that came out of, using and abusing, millions of workers. And yet to put that wealth to some good use, it's the complexity of that world, But to see those libraries across the United States is just a marvel and they are also architecturally interesting too. Beaverton in Oregon also has one.
I haven't been to that one.
Yeah.
I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, it's nice.
Well, preparing for this, I read a lot of reviews, and this was...
Don't do that one.
What's that? This is one of my favorites. It's just a little bit. It's from Esquire magazine. They write about the Cold Millions. Walter puts forth his most ambitious work yet, solidifying his place in the contemporary canon as one of our most gifted builders of fictional worlds. It's often said that a novel contains the world. Warm and deeply humane, this transporting novel is a staggering achievement from a landmark writer. So I'm curious, do you read reviews of your work?
Do I read reviews of my work? No. I just wanted that on the record. I do. When I started, I think I was a little more gun-shy about it. And I get treated really well by reviewers. I feel sometimes like one of these times someone's just gonna, say, I think you guys are giving this guy too much credit. I think he's hitting the sauce and just typing blindly. But so I do tend to read them, and I found that I'm not stung by negative reviews. The worst review I ever got was for Zero by a writer I really admire, and we had to be on a panel a week later. And when I first read the review, I was like, oh, that stings. And then I read it again, and I thought, you know what? He gives me credit for aspiring to do the thing I set out to do. Some people read that book, I think, in a more simplistic way, and he said, this is what this is attempting to do, and here's why it fails. And I was so pleased with that review that by the time we got to the panel, I said, I have to tell you, that's one of my favorite reviews of all time. And I think the word failure is in it twice. You know? And it just made me, again, realize that this is a conversation with the reader, and the reviewer may not think you've accomplished the thing you set out to do. The only phrases I don't like are like, this isn't my cup of tea, or whatever. It's like, well, have a different cup of tea. Like, you know, but for the most part, I do read the reviews, and I tend to take joy in even the ones that don't like it very much, you know. And I usually think, yeah, you're kind of right, that the female characters are a little flat in this one. I'll do better next time. So, yeah.
I was intrigued by the concept in this review. They write that a novel contains the world.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you?
With the Cold Millions, I think it means a lot. I tried to write a multiphonic novel. It isn't just Gig and Rye's story. You have these first-person stories coming in. And for me, that was important in part because that's what I think of in the early 1900s. The way the internet opened the whole world, the railroad did that. All of a sudden, the country was one place. And I wanted, and yet it was at this transition away from characters like Jules, and I wanted all these different voices to come in. I wanted you to feel like you had spent some time in 1909, not that you had just been looking over the shoulder of one character. I don't think every novel does show you the world, frankly, and I think it's a kind of fiction that I miss. This novel, of course, talks a lot about War and Peace, which I think is one of those novels that immerses you so fully in a world, not the world certainly, but in a world. And it was something, it was definitely sort of fiction that I was thinking
My turn.
Back to the bad cop.
That's right, I got a hard one too. So in books, we can really clearly see how problems and obstacles are impetus for characters to grow and change, to become something different than they were in the beginning. Do you think that books also do that for society? It feels like some of your books are tackling some pretty big issues in our society. And if you do, what is your hope for what your books will ignite in the world?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, I, of course, like most people, have my political preferences and my ideas about how the world should run. No one has ever really paid attention to those before, and so I don't feel like in a novel I'm trying to get across any sort of lesson about the world, except in the idea that we will connect with characters who maybe are nothing like us. So you can see Gig and Rye, and I was especially moved, I think, in 2008 when homelessness really started to crack as an issue. It's not nearly as bad as wasn't nearly as bad then as it is now. But just the way people in my town tended to look down on someone who had lost everything and was living on the street, as if they had done something wrong. And I started thinking about a moment in history like the Great Depression, when 1/4 of all men were out of work. Women weren't even in the workplace, so they were mostly all out of work. And people were just pushed, as my grandfathers were, to live on the rails and to go into a work camp and hope to find a job. No internet, you don't know when you arrive in Squim or in St. Mary's if there's a job. You've just heard that they're hiring at this log camp. You show up, as happens with Gig and Rye in the book, the only thing you carry with you is your body. You have to sometimes pay for meals. If you cut a finger off, the way my grandfather did on a road crew, you pay for that yourself. There's no medical care. People didn't blame other people for their hard circumstances. And I felt a sort of hardening of hearts over in my town, because most of the homeless people we encountered were the mental patients or the people with drug addictions. That's like the froth on top of a much larger wave built on a system that we've all taken part of without knowing, which is that as we've lost our pensions, we've lost security of jobs, the only wealth we have left is in our home. Everyone wants their home to keep getting more valuable because that's the generation of middle-class wealth. Well, if that's the only value that we all have to retire to, who wants a shelter built in their neighborhood? Who wants a cheap apartment building? So we built a system where we're going to push people out the bottom and they're not going to be able to afford housing. We're going to see those ones with mental illnesses and drug addictions. So all of that soapbox is to say, if you read about two characters like Vig and Rye, maybe the next time you see someone on the street, you won't make those assumptions. And I think going back to my book, We Live in Water, which is a short story collection about the people that we sort of drive past, that's been a concern of mine, is to just tap ever so lightly on your empathy muscle and remind you that, if no one likes to be panhandling at the grocery store, I totally agree, but that's the symptom of a much deeper issue. And so if I have any sort of aims within changing people's minds, it's only to remind them of the great power of empathizing with people who are beneath you on this economic ladder that we're all on. And to remind you that in the world, almost everyone would kill to be in the economic position you're in. And that while we're passing laws that allow billionaires to enrich themselves during a pandemic, we're also not taking care of the least of us, those on the bottom. So yeah, I guess I am much more political. But again, I think the only way to get that across is with narrative that makes you step outside yourself briefly.
Thank you. That's one of the reasons I read.
Oh yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what it's like to write about real people in a fictional way, as with Elizabeth Gurley-Flynn you mentioned earlier? Do you worry about the reaction of family or fans of the historical figure? And how true to real life do you try to be?
Yeah, I've sort of always dabbled with that. In my novel, Citizen Vince, I always envisioned it would take place over 7 days. And I remember I got toward the end of it and I'm like, oh, I've only got 6 days of action. And I said, I could just cut that 7th day. And it's about a guy in the witness protection program trying to decide whether to vote for Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan or John Anderson, who was the third party candidate that year. And so in a moment of kind of creative insanity, I said, I'm going to all of a sudden put Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan in my novel. And so there's just a moment where you get with both of those characters. And it was so thrilling to do with those two characters, because it's just a glimpse of both of them. And then the next time was Richard Burton in Beautiful Ruins. And that was a little more audacious. I'm not going to give away the ending of that book, but if Richard Burton does not have a love child from an out-of-marriage affair, it would be both a miracle and so creating a situation where he might have fathered someone out of wedlock did not seem like such a great leap. When he would tell people he liked, he was married, but then he would bring a mistress to every movie set. But it couldn't be someone too picky because he also liked to sleep with the makeup girl if she would have him, or the hairdresser, so he was that sort of figure. And then with the Cold Millions, I felt a very different responsibility, because these aren't, Elizabeth Gurley-Flynn is someone who in my mind had slipped through the pages of history and deserved to be rediscovered. And I felt a little bit more responsibility. I read her autobiography, The Rebel Girl, and was just blown away. Her first autobiography, which just tracks her through the first 35 years or so. And I just thought, this is a character I want to have the fullness of who she was. And so with that character, I tried not to invent as much as I normally do, and to have her sort of adjacent to the fictional story that I had envisioned. And so most of the speeches she gives in the novel come from things she actually said. She really did do a tour of all these rough labor camps. I don't know that she went to Taft, Montana, which is one of the most harrowing scenes in the book. But that was the fiction writer saying, all right, enough of this historical respect. Let's send her to the worst place you could imagine. But she very much, I think, represents both the audacity, the courage, and the insecurity of that character as that real historical person. John Sullivan, another, several of the labor leaders, I tried to have them exist in the novel as they did, and not have any of them all of a sudden pull out a sword or a lightsaber or anything too fictional. Because I felt a responsibility to bring this story back to the fore, because I felt disappointed myself that I had never learned about it at school, or that it wasn't something that was known even in Spokane.
Okay, well, thank you, Jess. That takes us about halfway through our time together. So this is where I know everyone out there has tons of great questions. We've hardly even touched upon the book. So what I want to do is just take 1 minute of quiet time for everyone to just write down your card. Anything else that comes up for you, just a moment to center yourself in your thoughts. Questions you have for Jess, questions about the book. Just going to take 1 minute. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just pair up. So just look around, just if you came with someone, that's fine. If you just, someone who's close to you, it's convenient. Just turn around to one other person, and we're just going to take a moment to share what we have written down with the other person, to tell them what we thought, to hear what they thought, to just discuss those questions, and we're just going to do this briefly. It's just going to take 2 or 3 minutes. Great, okay, so we're going to take it to the next level now. So now we're turning to another duo, and we're making a group of 4. And within your group of 4, talk about the questions. So now we're really focusing in on the questions for Jess. In your group of 4, surface what you think are your best 1 or 2 questions from your group of 4. Write those down in the card. We'll circulate with more cards if you need another card. And I'm gonna give you about 5 minutes to do this, and then I'm coming around and collect the card.
What an author's anxiety dream is like, which is a room full of people talking about you, but all you can hear is this low buzz. So I wake in terror every morning.
Jess, I'm so sorry. I'm not going to consider that at all.
No, I'm only kidding. It was so cool to see that. So,
it's very
my anxiety dreams are a lot duller than that.
Well, this is a really lightweight question for you then. I'm really curious what you're reading right now, and is there a book or author that is inspiring or important to you as a writer?
Is there a book or author inspiring? There are so many millions that it's really hard to know where to pick. I'll start with what I'm reading. I'm getting all sorts. One of the things as an author, you get blurb requests all the time. And so I just read Luis Urrea's new novel, which is coming out this summer, which is called Goodnight, Irene, which is about his mother serving in World War II, which is just terrific. That was really incredible. And then I taught at the University of Iowa in 2018, and I made the mistake of choosing a period when they had all these incredible students, so I'm writing blurbs for every one of my old students, and I keep waiting for a bad book to come through, but they don't. There's a novelist called Jeff Boyd who has a book called The Wait that's about to come out, which is really terrific too. I just finished reading Shirley Hazard. For those of you taking the class I'm teaching tomorrow, we'll be talking a little bit about the transit of Venus. I just finished reading her short stories, and I'm just kind of marveling at the synaptic fireworks that she sets off with her prose. So Shirley Hazard is kind of, and I'm leaving from from Seattle on Sunday. My wife and I are going to Europe for 5 weeks, and we're going to go to Capri, where Shirley Hazard and Graham Greene used to get sloshed together. So I'm hoping in honor of both of them to raise several glasses. As far as authors who are important, again, there are just so many that it's hard to know where to start. With the Cold Millions, I'm going to talk about, I guess, one, E.L. Doctorow, whose book Ragtime made me rethink the way you could include both historical figures, but I mean, Houdini just shows up on page 2 of that novel, but also the way the world opened up. I think of that as sort of my lens into 19th century, or early 20th century scene writing, and so Doctorow is someone that I go back to quite a bit. But so many, I mean, Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Edward P. Jones, and I'll just finish the rest of the alley if I don't stop.
Oh, I love just hearing those names get thrown out. Adding to my list. Okay, so we've got some great questions. Thanks everyone for participating in that. I'm just going to kind of group some things together and give Jess some choices about how to answer. But a
I'm
big
trying to
one.
do speed rounds, so I get through it. I won't do those long, aggressive answers right about measuring. So I'm doing it again. So sorry.
We've had 20 minutes, so hopefully we can get to them all. So a lot of questions about research. You do a lot of research, your historical figures, the movements in the book. Can you talk a little bit about how you go about doing that, sources in depth, and also if there's anything about the history of the labor movement in Eastern Washington or Northern Idaho, if there's anything you would recommend in terms of reading on those?
Yeah, I would start with a book called Big Trouble by J. Anthony Lucas. Incredible book about the bombing, the assassination of Governor Studenberg of Idaho in 1905, which precedes everything that happens in this book and is an incredible historical artifact that just talks about that time, talks about the Dynamite Express in Wallace, and talks a lot about the Pinkertons and the sort of shady figures. Early Reston, who's a figure in my novel, comes directly out of thinking about the Harry Orchard, who was the person who bombed, assassinated Frank Studenberg, and he was either a Pinkerton or not a Pinkerton, an anarchist or not an anarchist, playing both sides. Hard to tell exactly what his motivation was. And I love the idea, what if I wrote a character that I didn't even know his motivation? And which was great fun to be able to do. So that's a nonfiction book I would point you to. There were so many resources that I found that were kind of thrilling me, including some unpublished academic work by some doctoral students about the 1909 free speech protests. So a lot of my research was like that, but I spent a lot of time, of course, looking at newspaper microfilm. And newspapers then in Spokane, there were as many, in 1909, there was as many 6 newspapers that there would be people hawking on the street. The Spokesman Review, the Spokane Daily Chronicle, the Spokane Press, which was a more populist paper, the Industrial Worker, there was a black newspaper. There were so many different newspapers that were being, and so trying to track those down and read through them was a big part of it. But I'll give a quick plug for what I love about libraries, and that is that on the internet you type the thing you want to find on a recipe for this, and you'll get that recipe. But as a novelist, you often don't know what you're looking for. And so to just go wander the stacks, to go to the Northwest Room in Spokane and just find a book about vaudeville of the early 20th century, just lose yourself in that until the character starts rising. To find books about the Spokane tribe and its the way that in which they were systematically pushed off their land and driven to reservation. That kind of research to just the great thing to me about the Dewey Decimal System is the number along the books alongside the book I'm looking for. And so I miss the days when you could just wander into the library and not know what it was you were looking for. The research you do online, besides taking you sometimes to push ads and things you don't want, also just is so hyper-focused. But yeah, I did years of research. In the beginning, it was more like a magpie. I would just see little bits of information, and I would think, oh, that's how much a suit cost in 1910, and I would just file it away. And then in the end, it would be to answer specific questions. Oh, I have a character needs to go to Wallace. What train would they take? What time would they leave? Because if there are two things that if you get them wrong in a novel, you will hear from angry readers. One is trains and the other is guns. Like if you, so I want to write a Western where I have the trains all wrong and the guns all wrong. He fired the 18th shot from his Colt revolver and you just watch some guy's head blow up. Jumped on a train and he was in Kansas City within an hour. But those kinds of details you have to do. And you always get something wrong. People always write you and say, you know, you got this detail wrong. And I always go, fiction.
You already touched on the next big question, which is, you know, some of these minor characters in the book are just so fascinating and juicy and wonderful. Early, Jules, Ursula. Can you say anything more about where they came from, or how, you know, if you knew them in the beginning, or if they developed in the story, or how?
Yeah, again, I'm seeing this as a big people novel. I'm writing about kind of communal ideas here, and so I wanted it to feel like you know, got this whole sense of the place. And so it was important to me to have those other figures rise up. I think the first one for me was Jules. One of the first things I wrote was the kid, this guy stealing a ferry in 1864, and I thought, how does this fit into the novel? One of my favorite novels of all time is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And to have a novel that ostensibly begins in 1864 with the theft of the ferry and ends in 1964 with Rye walking along the river after finding out that his friend Elizabeth Gurley Flynn has died was to me a way to give a sort of nod to 100 Years of Solitude of one of the most isolated cities I know, Spokane, Washington. And so that idea of having this be more than just the story of being in Rye, but being the sort of reflection of that time. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's an amazing character, but she's so singular. Most women did not have that sort of agency. So it was important to me to create a character like Ursula, who had a different sort of agency that she had to create herself. And then that character, you end up liking them so much. There was a moment when Ursula's sister says to her, you know, your weakness is men, and she says, well then let's get on with it. You know, I was like, Ursula. Like all of a sudden I love that character. And those moments when a character, through a line of dialogue or thinking about them in a certain way, reveal themselves, are some of my favorite. There's a character named Del Dalbo in the novel who is a horrible, nasty Pinkerton. And it was so fun to write this character, and yet his death just haunts me still in the book. I don't want to give anything away, but he gets stabbed and steered around like with the tiller of a boat. And I was like, oh, that sounds so horrible. I'm having so much fun writing this. And you know, and then he has this moment of humanity at the end. He thinks about his grandson, who is like 4 or 8, and I love the fact that he doesn't really know. You know, this moment of humanity revealed to be not a very good human, not a good example of humanity. So those characters are so fun to write, but I think they give the novel a richness that they wouldn't have had for me if it was just following Gabriel Rye. And one more thing about that, Rye is not a classic protagonist. The hero of the novel is really Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. He is, I think of him in many ways as the field upon which this novel is played. And so to do that, I wanted these other bigger characters, because Rye is so careful and such an observer. I wanted these other bigger characters to really move the narrative.
Okay, so on that note, which brother do you identify with more closely?
Boy, that's tricky. You know, I'm the older brother. I have a younger brother, and I guess I would say both and neither. I think I'm more the idea-driven one. I was much more likely in my early 20s to pronounce a book that I'd only read 2/5 of as the greatest work of literature of all time. And so I suppose a little bit the older brother, but my older brother is so much more charming and, you know, handsome. And I get these My brother's a bachelor, 52-year-old bachelor, and these nice women will come up at readings in Spokane and say, I want to ask about your brother. Is he single? And I'll say, he's single like a 1960s astronaut. He's single, but it's going to be a time warp. He's going to mix you a cocktail and then have you out the door right after that. So if you want, that's what you're looking for, I say go for it. But, so I think my brother's more like gig in that way.
So there's a question here about narrative, about interspersing the first person narrative and the third person narrative. That's kind of a structural question.
There's a central motif in the novel, which is the river. The river is, to me, the novel. I want this thing to be this winding novel. And I started thinking as the main channel of the river, the third person sections that were Gig and Rye, where we're following them. And in those sections, there's very much an authorial presence telling you, this is America, this is these people, I'm with you. And then I wanted those first person sections to be like the tributaries or the water that flows in from the watershed that adds speed to the river, but comes in from some other direction and then speeds up the action. And that for me carries all the way through. The river, of course, begins in 1864 with the ferry, and then goes all the way through that thing that happens to Gig at the end that I won't give away, all the way to, which is a replay in many ways of what happens to the kid on the ferry, to Rye walking along the river. You'll notice in those sections there's a date by each one of them if that's the last moment we're going to see them. And I had never really read first-person sections in which we follow the character to their death. And a lot of times for me, I'm just doing something I've never done before, like a writing assignment. Can you write a character all the way to that last moment? And having done that with the kid in that first section that goes over the falls, I thought, oh, what if I can keep doing that? You may notice in that last section, it says Rye, 1964. And so we don't see his death, but it's not long after. And I love the idea that he and Gurley Flynn kind of depart the planet at the same time. And I ended up feeling such a sense of intimacy with those characters. Like I had seen them at some really profound moment. It was, for a writer, it was an experience I'd never had, where I felt this real responsibility and this kind of tenderness, even for someone like Del Road. Just like, oh, poor Del, what a way to go.
Wow, I just want to acknowledge, I don't know who it is out there, but someone really hit on this theme about death and about the characters are actually speaking to us after they died in some ways. And so you kind of addressed, like, you came up with that idea somehow, or?
Yeah, I think because I was writing about real historical figures, there was a real moment of just kind of catharsis and epiphany for me when I was. This all takes place in Spokane, which is a turn-of-the-century city that fell on hard times for 80 years. And so, you know when you buy a house where no one messed it up in the 70s or 80s with mauve tile? That's kind of what Spokane is like architecturally. So I'm walking through this city, seeing the same place that my characters lived in. And I remember walking near my house, I thought, oh, this is where John Sullivan was killed. And I rode my bike and I stood in front of the house and I just got this chill because I was standing in the same place where the assassin shot me. And to have the history be that alive was wild to me. And I thought, I'm writing about, in some cases, people who actually existed. I'm writing about them years later. And I am, we are sort of channeling their stories. And to write John Sullivan at the end of the book, this complex figure who's neither hero nor villain, but someone who believes very strongly in what he did. I did have that feeling that was sort of out of body, that this is the dead speaking in a way, which in a way every novel kind of is. When you read Virginia Woolf, you're not far away from the fact that she filled her pockets with rocks and walked into a stream. You are reading the very intimate, deep thoughts of someone who cared enough about the world to share with you their perceptions of it. And those characters, in many ways, are doing some of the same things. And I think I felt that more profoundly with this book than any that I've ever written. That was a great question. I did write that one. No, I didn't. I'm really smarter than
Does he sell out, or does he grow up, or what happens to him?
Does he sell it or does he grow? That's such a fascinating question. I mean, it's one of those moments when you have created a character and you think, what would they do? And I thought, Rye wants security. And then at some point you're like, he kind of deserves it, you know? And I think I was also honoring a man like my father who, who dropped out of high school, joined the Navy, dropped out of middle school. Sorry, I was going to tell the truth, Dad. Joined the Navy and then raised a family. And Rye benefits from the activism of someone like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn because unions helped create this middle class that briefly existed until we started dismantling the middle class through tax policy and other things in the 1980s. And so Rye benefits from that stuff. So part of it was me wanting the novel to reflect that. But it also just was Rye's character. I think he had been for so long on the outside of society. And what does he want? He wants to belong. Like realizing how much he wanted a new suit, how much he wanted to have. I mean, when you realize, oh my gosh, my hobo is a clothes horse, you know, you feel this tenderness toward the character, and he's imperfect, you know. Gig is imperfect because his activism is a sort of blind activism that leads him into trouble. Rye, his quest for security, I think a lot of us might identify with. We might not join the march, but we might sympathize. And I think Rye is someone who he describes as he's standing on the street when the parade goes by. And I think that was both reflected in what I wanted the novel to do with these large characters all around, and in the scope that I wanted to have pass. He's a good man, but limited in what he will do for a cause like this. But does he sell out? I mean, I don't think he does. I think he tries to protect his brother. You have to remember, he's 17 when a lot of this is taking place. And so I think his understanding of it, and it's something I really identify with. I think I understand things so clearly about 3 years too late. You know, that's what I should have done. And I feel like Rye is that sort of character.
Okay, we're just going to jump. This is the last thing. So I get to stay up here and look really smart because you all have these amazing questions.
They really were great questions. that nightmare is going to go away.
So this last one, I don't know anything about this. A tiny sense of accomplishment?
Yeah, my old podcast.
Somebody wants to know if you're going to revive that.
Are we going to revive that tiny sense of accomplishment? No, probably not. My good friend Sherman Alexi is sort of stepped back after some personal problems. I think he's such an important writer that we need to always be reading him. But we had quit the podcast before that. I love Sherman. He was the worst person to do a podcast with. And he will even tell you that somebody with and writers in general tend to be a little manic depressive. So if you get two depressives in the podcast booth at the same time, it's like, what do you want to talk about? And in the days when we're both manic, no one can get a word in. So, but I think the real death blow was we were American Public Media's third most popular podcast. And so they offered us a full-time contract of $7,000 each. We make more than that by giving speech, right? And, so I quickly understood, as one of the pioneers of podcasting, that except for the tiny little froth at the top, mostly true crime things, that everyone else is doing is a labor of love. And I don't think we loved it that much. So, but it's really great to have people come up and still talk about it. And Sherman and I still continue those basketball conversations and writing conversations. So maybe someday we'll put it back on the air. I don't know.
Wow. Well, thank you,
Yeah,
Jess.
thank you all.